but we'll kick things off. So just to welcome you all to the first event of 2021 for the Engineers Ireland Energy, Environment and Climate Action Division. And we're delighted to be kicking off the year with a really important report that's been recently published. It's Our Zero Emissions Future, and it was something which was done in collaboration between the Electricity Association of Ireland and the UCC, with MaREI and UCC. I think for someone who works delving into these models in great detail at times, I can appreciate the fact that there's 4 scenarios and 5 different sensitivities in each scenario. So 20 model runs is pretty formidable undertaking. But I think the team have done a great job, and it's going to be a great service to Ireland as we chart our path towards the 2030 targets. Here to speak with us this evening, we're very lucky to have Paul Deane. Paul is a Senior Research Fellow at the Environmental Research Institute in MaREI in UCC. He's author or co-author of over 100 technical papers on a whole broad range of topics in relation to future energy. And he was also the first author on the 2015 report, Ireland's Low Carbon Roadmap. He's no stranger to us here at the EECA division, being a very highly esteemed former member of our committee. So very happy to have Paul with us this evening, and I'll hand over to you, Paul, now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bernice, and hello everybody. It's great to be the first talk of the year, so it's probably a little bit too late to wish everybody a happy new year. But let me just say that wherever you are in Ireland or the world, I hope you're well, I hope you're safe and you're happy. I'm coming to you from Clonakilty in West Cork tonight. It's a beautiful day down here. We had the daffodils have just popped out in our garden, so there's a great sense of hope coming through, and I hope you're feeling that too wherever you are as well. So the format for today, or for this evening, I'm going to take maybe about 30 or 40 minutes or so just to talk about this report, and then we'll get to your questions. As Bernice said, I work in the MaREI Centre, and MaREI is the, let me just move on here. MaREI is the Science Foundation Ireland Centre for Energy, Climate and Marine, and we're based down in UCC. About 200 staff across a lot of institutions around Ireland, and we do a lot of research on thinking about the future of energy, about biodiversity, about marine systems. And I work there with the Energy Policy and Modelling Group. I work with a lovely group of people. I work with colleagues Brian O'Gallagher, Hannah Daly, James Glynn, Finn Rogan, and Laura Megan. And Laura was really instrumental in this report here, actually, and did a huge amount of the heavy lifting in this report with me. So this report actually was launched. We launched it, just saying to Sinead offline before we came on air there. We launched this report back in November 20. It was launched actually by Minister Ryan and these group of speakers here who provided reflections on the report. That seems so long ago now, but as Bernice mentioned, this report was done in association or in collaboration with the Electricity Association of Ireland. And a huge thanks to Dara, Stephen, Niamh, and Gemma, and all the team over in EAI as well. And the Electricity Association of Ireland represent most of the generators in Ireland and a big bunch of the suppliers of electricity as well. So the report that I'm going to chat to you about tonight is available on their website. Just go on to EA, Electricity Association of Ireland. You can download the report. We put a lot of effort into making the report language accessible. It's not too technical. We tried to stretch it out wherever we could. And as Bernice said, there's really a whole wealth of information in there. I won't be able to go through all of the scenarios or all the sensitivities in there this evening, but it's all there for you to kind of look at in your own time. And again, huge thanks to Laura Megan. I'm not sure if Laura is listening in tonight, but if you are, Laura, a big thank you again for doing so much on this report and all those, I'd say even hundreds of hours of modelling at this stage. When I was just preparing for this talk tonight, I was reflecting on this report and just kind of thinking back, well, when did we start this? And it was about a year ago, actually. It was about in the end of February, beginning of March. And I remember that actually is a special place for me because it was, I think it was the last group of people, actually, it was probably the last time I was outside of Cork City or outside of Cork County, actually. It was the last group of people that large group that we met. I think we met up in Dublin with all the stakeholders. And the EAI have a quite diverse number of stakeholders, from with different generation assets, different views on the future, different strategies and all this, but with a really constructive engagement. And I remember actually, I was looking at my notes before we came online there. And one of the things I'd written down as I came away from that meeting, even though we were all a bit nervous, it was in the news, they were talking about COVID and Brexit, we were really worried about that. But I came away from that meeting feeling really positive, actually. And I remember looking at my notes, and I'd written down a huge appetite for decarbonisation in Ireland. And that was one of the lasting things that stuck with me, even though we're speaking to a huge diversity of generator assets and portfolios. There was really a huge common unity in the appetite for decarbonisation, and also a very acute understanding of the risks, a very acute understanding of the uncertainty and the massive amounts of money that we have to put into the system. And this is, I guess, why this report came around. Is it was trying to look at that uncertainty, trying to see how can we de-risk the future and put some numbers with those narratives, because this report really, there's two ways of looking at it. Dara from the EAI has a lovely phrase. He calls it, it's a postcard from the future, which is beautifully poetic, I think, and encapsulates it really well. And I like to think about it as kind of holding a mirror up to the current climate action policy in Ireland around electricity and seeing what it reflects. Do we like that reflection? Where are the gaps? What needs to be improved? And what is the future that we're actually striving towards? And again, if there's anyone out there, this is an Engineers Ireland talk for young graduates, or anyone looking for a change of career, there's huge opportunities here in Ireland. We're incredibly lucky to have such rich utilities united with that appetite of decarbonisation. So for graduates listening tonight, might be studying energy engineering in UCC or in UCD or Galway or Limerick or whatever, this is a wonderful cause. Just throw yourself at it. There's huge opportunities here in Ireland. There's huge employment opportunities. There's a real appetite and a real need for sharp engineers who are climate literate and who are enthusiastic about solving big problems. So a lot of positives, I think, to take away from this report and from this study that we really enjoyed. So do get involved, read the report, and try and get involved in being part of the solution. So again, let me just start by talking you through the stepping stones that we'll look at tonight. I'm going to start out just framing the study, telling you where we're starting from. We're going to look a bit at our emissions and our energy system in Ireland. We're going to talk about what we found in the study, some surprises, stuff that surprised me, and then we'll wrap up with our key findings. And again, as I said, a lot of this stuff is actually in the report already, so I won't be able to go into all in detail, but there's huge reading in there as well. So when you're starting off thinking about the future, it's always important to look at the future through different lenses. And the first lens that we looked in this report was through the lens of decarbonisation. And this is really important, because in Ireland and in engineers as well, we talk a lot about, RESI and terawatt hours and megawatts of this and interconnectors and batteries. But what does it mean for emissions? What does it mean for our emissions reduction targets? What does it mean for Ireland's journey on a pathway to net zero? So a big part of this study was actually looking at the emissions output. And emissions is a wonderful thing to look at, because if you're focusing on RESI, for example, or renewable electricity or renewable energy as a whole, you tend to focus on the supply side only. But when you stand back and you look at the decarbonisation of the full system, you start to look at, oh yeah, there's a supply side and there's the grid in the middle and there's the demand side. So I think a real strong feature of this report was looking at the full decarbonisation of the electricity system and understanding where does that fit in regard to, for example, the Paris Climate Change Agreement. Where does it fit within our climate budgets? And this really, I think, builds and adds a lot to the existing reports that are out there. Some incredible work in Ireland done by Airgrid, Sony, Iea for their 2030 20 by 70 study. And I'd like to think that this study kind of fills a gap by kind of looking at it in terms of the decarbonisation space. Where do we need to be? Because one of the challenges is, as an engineer, if you're talking about RESI, and RESI in general, renewable electricity, it's not a helpful proxy when you're thinking about climate action. And let me give you a very short example. If we look at different projections of electricity demand into the future, we take Airgrid's, let's just say high demand scenario and Airgrid's low demand scenario. For the same given level of RESI, the difference in emissions is about 1 million tons. So talking about emissions is really powerful because it allows us to see into the climate journey that we're on. And of course, that's not to knock talking about renewable electricity, but having an improved climate literacy, having an improved energy literacy allows us to make that connection between the supply side, the grid, and the demand side. And that's really important. That's something that we really enjoy doing in the study. And then, of course, you got to think about reliability. You know, decarbonisation is the driver of the future, but your power systems must be reliable, and they must be secure, and they must be adequate. And often what I do in class in UCC, I ask our students just to think about the last time you had a power cut in your home. You know, when was it? And for most of them, you know, if it was outside a major storm or the retreat, but most of them just haven't really experienced, you know, any type of power or a significant power interruption. And in Ireland, you know, we're so lucky in many regards. I remember when I was a kid, I was chatting to one of my neighbours, and I was a kid, and we used to come in from home with my mom. My mom would kind of drag us in from Quinsworth or Tesco's or wherever it was back in the day. This was back in the late 80s and the early 90s. And my mom, she'd always come into the kitchen, and she'd look up at the Sacred Heart. Now, for those of you who don't know, the Sacred Heart it's a religious picture that a lot of houses used to have in Ireland. It shows you how much it changed. Now, my mom was an incredibly religious woman, loved her to bits, but she used to look up at the Sacred Heart just to see was the electricity on. And that was a common thing in our community. It was people coming in, looking up, oh, the power's on, we're okay. And that wasn't too long ago. And since the 90s, you know, Ireland's economic growth, our industrial growth, and our social growth has been based on that reliability of the power system. We have an incredible, reliable power system in Ireland, and we're starting to take it for granted. And even if you look back at the start of this month, look at what happened with the different alerts. Look at the huge volumes of gas that were coming in on the system during that cold snap in January. So reliability is incredibly important, and it overlaps and it's linked to decarbonisation, because if we don't get the reliability of the system right, that really damages the reputational credibility of the decarbonisation strategy. And you know, the public, media in general, will not forgive us if we don't get the reliability of the system right. So the two lenses that we looked in this report were the decarbonisation. Where are we going in terms of emissions in 2030? If we look at the climate action plan and look at a 70% renewable electricity target, and then how can we make sure, you know, what's the kind of capacity that we need in that system to make sure it's reliable, to make sure it's adequate, and to make sure it's resilient. And within this study, we'll talk about it later on, we modeled not only all these 20 or so different scenarios, but we modeled about 250,000 hours of different weather data to make sure that the system is resilient and reliable to lots of variations of weather. The last section here is markets. This is the element that we didn't look at, because really when you understand the decarbonisation trajectory, where you need to be in terms of emissions, when you understand what the reliability of your systems need, then you got to wrap your market around that. And that was the element that we didn't look at in the study. It's an incredibly important element, but these first two elements were decarbonisation and reliability. So we wanted to understand, what does the system need to look like? We know we're going to have 70% renewable electricity. That's brilliant. Certainly not an easy task. What does the other 30% need to look like? How does that impact the wider economy and the wider energy system in Ireland? They were the fundamental questions that we wanted to answer. And this is important because we need to talk about those markets. We need to talk about what we do after 2030. And this report, I think, is very helpful because it allows us to put some numbers with those narratives. Often in the energy space in Ireland and in Europe and globally, we have these broad conversations at kind of 30,000 feet. This report tries to bring it down to ground level and help us have meaningful conversations, because we do need to have a dialogue or some kind of conversation about where we are going with our electricity system and our energy system and our decarbonisation journey in Ireland. So let me just start off, first of all, and just very briefly, I'm going to take 2 slides and just talk about our emissions and our energy profile, because it's very important to understand where are we starting out from. If we're on a decarbonisation journey, we need to understand where we're coming from, and then about our energy profile also in Ireland. So just starting off with our emissions, in Ireland, we produce about 16 million tonnes of greenhouse gas emissions. These are 2029 figures. This year, 2020 will be, or last year, will be a tiny bit lower because of COVID, maybe about 5% lower. 60 million tonnes of greenhouse gases is actually quite a lot for a small country. It gives us one of the largest greenhouse gas footprints per capita in Europe. So when we look at all our greenhouse gases, wrapped around those 60 million tonnes, we have a couple of policy levers. We've got our ETS emissions, which many of you in the electricity sector would be very familiar. ETS is a pan-European scheme where we can trade emissions. And then we have our non-ETS emissions trading system. And the non-ETS is actually where Ireland's binding emission reduction targets come from at a European level. And actually, when you stand back and look at Ireland, Ireland's quite unusual. There's a very large exposure to non-ETS in Ireland. And the reason is because agriculture, about 1/3 of our emissions are actually coming from agriculture, 20% from transport, and another 20% or so from the wide energy sector. And of course, those energy sector emissions fall within the ETS. So then we've wrapped around these, we've got emissions reductions targets. These are our non-ETS targets. So often when you hear in the news about Ireland not meeting its emissions reduction targets, these are the emissions reduction targets that we're talking about for the areas outside of electricity, sometimes called non-traded, sometimes called non-ETS targets. And then we also have overlapping renewable energy targets. So our renewable energy targets are based on all our gross energy consumption, and they overlap in the areas of heat, transport, and electricity. And it's interesting actually, because if you look at this, you're going to see, well, actually, we don't actually have emissions reductions targets for the electricity sector. And that's a bit strange, because actually those emissions fall within the ETS, and often that leads to some kind of confusion, but it is complex within the ETS. So we have overlapping renewable energy targets within the energy sector itself. And then if we stand back and just open up the sunburst diagram and say, well, where do all those emissions come from? We see, the big areas for challenging in Ireland. We've got agriculture, cattle are a big source of emissions. Road transport, and the thing about road transport, those emissions are growing. This is actually really a really big problem. And then we have electricity production. And really, if you're standing back and being honest about Ireland's emissions profile, electricity has really been the success story. Emissions in electricity production are about 12%. They're probably down around 10 million tons this year. But of course, going forward into the future, electricity will be a strong decarbonisation lever for transport and for heating, which is really, really important. So really, electricity needs to get out of those traps quickly and needs to lead from the front in terms of that decarbonisation journey that we want to go on. And if we look at our energy systems, if we look at the energy system itself, so remember, energy is responsible for about 2/3 of our emissions in Ireland. That's about 37 million tons based on the latest EPA numbers. And this is what we're looking at here is what we call a Sankey diagram. This is kind of these kind of rich engineering diagrams. And this shows us the primary inputs on the left-hand side, consumption on the right-hand side, and we've got some transformation on electricity then in the middle. So about 37 million tons. But look at our system. Look, it's a system like many European countries, like many modern economies in the world, that's dominated by oil. Let me just move this out of the way here. That's dominated by transport. So huge use of oil right across the system. And then if you look at our electricity sector, you see the main fuels that we use there in 2019 are gas, coal, peat, and we've got wind coming in on the bottom. And again, looking at the end uses, with strong end use for electricity in the commercial, in the residential, and in the industrial sectors, and not so much in transport. But we're going to see in 2030 how that lever for transport changes small. But now, when you're thinking about the future, if you're thinking about 2050, if you're thinking about 2030, this picture would change dramatically, and even in the last, this is a 2019 diagram. If you look at 2020, we've already seen significant changes. Big reduction in peat, big reduction in coal. And that actually has led to probably historic low emissions within the power sector in Ireland for 2020. The carbon intensity of electricity is probably around 300 grams per kilowatt hour, I estimate, for the year 2020, which is a huge success. And of course, wind there at the bottom being a huge driver of decarbonisation as well, and helping us drive that system forward. So if we isolate the electricity system on its own, the electricity system in 2019 was about 9 million tons. And again, the primary inputs into the electricity system in Ireland are gas and wind, a bit of peat and coal, which are coming off the bars. And again, on the right-hand side, on the supply side, we see strong demand from the residential, strong demand from industrial, and of course that will grow as data center demand is projected to grow into the future. And transport, electricity and transport today is primarily, it's not so much EVs. EVs are very small in terms of electricity demand. That's mainly things like the Lewis Dart and different metro and bits and pieces they are going into transport at the moment. But as I said, that must change significantly into the future. And it's often important just to step back into the, and actually this picture here as well, actually, if I just go back here one, this system in 2019 or 2020, that's actually a RES-E of a renewable electricity level of just under 40%. I'm not sure whether we came in for 2020 or not. I know that there was some talk about Ireland hitting the 40% target, but the target, the official target, which actually is a national target, has to be normalized yet. But we'll be there or thereabouts in terms of our renewable electricity, which is a good thing. But unfortunately, within the wider economy, we've missed our renewable energy target, which is at 16%. We only came in at about 13%. And we've also missed our emissions reductions target for those non-ETS sectors that I spoke at the start. Our emissions reduction target was a 20% reduction. I think we only got a couple of percent at the end. So all that really needs to change. So it's important to stand back and say, well, where does Ireland sit in terms of Europe? And if we look at the European grid, see what others are doing. And we see Ireland, we're probably coming in at about 300 grams per kilowatt hour in 2020. That's a huge improvement from 1990. 1990, we were about 900 grams per kilowatt hour. So massive jump forward for Ireland there in terms of decarbonisation. Still, we're above the European average. You know, European average is probably around 220, 212 grams per kilowatt hour. But of course, Ireland doesn't have the same advantages that a lot of the other countries have. We don't have large nuclear in Ireland. We don't have large hydro storage systems in Ireland. We don't have large, you know, like Norway and Austria and those places. So we have a lot to improve really in terms of getting our emissions down. And this is what I was chatting about in the future in terms of our climate literacy. We focus a lot on renewable electricity. We focus a lot on renewable energy, and that's helpful. But really, when you're talking about climate action, at the end of the day, it's emissions that really matter. It's emissions that are driving our temperature increases across the world, and it's emissions that we really need to be focusing on. So what do we do in this study? And essentially what we did was we took a lot of documents that are in the public domain already. So we looked at the government's climate action plan, and we took as many of those assumptions as we could. We took the perspectives on EVs, we took the perspectives on heat pumps, and we made this an all-island study. So we took information from Sony, took different information from the UK government, and we built out an all-island electricity model. But then, of course, we need to understand the impact of interconnectors, you know, to France and UK. So we built out a pan-European model. So each of those European member states is represented by what they submitted as part of their national climate and energy action plan. So this allows us to really understand the bulk flows of electricity through interconnectors right across not only Northwest Europe and our part of Europe, but right across Europe in general. And this is very important because as we interconnect more in the future, we really need to understand who are we interconnecting to and who are they interconnecting to, because there's consequential knock-on impacts of interconnectors. We did the study as an hourly unit commitment and dispatch model. For those of you who like this kind of things, this is a mixed integer programming. We used the Plexus commercial software. Again, you know, academic software probably wouldn't be strong enough for this kind of thing. You really have to get commercial grade models. We modeled about 250,000 hours. That's 30 different weather years through each of the scenarios. And that's really important because, as I said at the start, when you're putting more wind and you're putting more renewables, putting more solar on the system, you really need to understand the impact of weather on that system. And we often think of security of supply these days in terms of geopolitical risk, and that's correct. Geopolitics does impact security of supply. But into the future, we're going to be swapping that geopolitics for kind of weather impacts. So we really need to understand impacts of extreme weather, and I'll talk about some extreme weather and some extreme weather windows at the end. And also, this was we did lots of sensitivities. There's tons of sensitivities within the model, within the report. And one of the nice things I think that we did with the study is that we handed over the whole model and the database and all the data to the stakeholders themselves, over to EAI and their members. And this is really important for transparency and also for themselves, so they can do extra sensitivities and do whatever they want with the model. So very detailed model, looking at the year 2030. We took as much as we could from available in the public domain. For Ireland, that was primarily the climate action plan, and we modeled it. And let me share with you now what we understood. And of course, the core, I suppose, overarching policy that was common to all the different scenarios and sensitivities that we ran was at least a 70% renewable electricity target in Ireland, so aligned with our national perspective on renewable electricity in Ireland. So what did we find? So this was the system again. You remember the system? This was for 2019. So if you can just take a quick snapshot of this in your mind, this is the system that we have today, with 9 million tons. And in 2030, if we look at our policy targets, if we look at our ambition for renewable electricity, we'll probably have this type of system. Now, maybe just to clarify here as well, this is what I'm presenting here. Actually, the results in these Sankeys are for ROI, the Republic of Ireland. The rest of the results actually will be for the all Ireland, but it's just a little bit easier to get the exact, more recent data for the Republic of Ireland only. So look at our system now in 2030. A couple of the obvious things. The solid fuels are gone. And this is a real big impact for our emissions. So our emissions will drop way down to about 4.5 million tons. That gives us a grid intensity of about 110 grams per kilowatt hour, and that's pretty good. That brings us below the current European average and kind of sets us on a good direction of travel. But if you look at it, we're kind of essentially on the supply side. We're coming into a dual fuel system. We're going to have a lot of wind. Now there's wind and solar and little bits and pieces and bio and hydro and waste in there as well, but they're just grouped together in these categories. And that will give us a 70% renewable electricity target. Now, one of the things I think that's most confused within the wider policy debate in Ireland is a confusion between renewable electricity and renewable energy. Remember, electricity is about a fifth of our final end use. The rest of it isn't electricity, it's fossil fuels. So often when we talk to climate campaigners and we talk to different advocates, there's sometimes a confusion around electricity and renewable energy. And many of the, for looking at MaREI, a lot of the climate campaigners and the Futures for Friday and different groups we'd speak to, they often talk about, well, in 2030, 70% of our energy will be clean. So why, we can just push it to the next 100%. Another 30% doesn't matter. But that's not the same. Electricity isn't the same as energy, and 70% renewable electricity is not 70% renewable energy. And in fact, if we look at the most recent climate action plan, we'll have about 30% renewable energy when we step back and look at the broad economy, which actually means that 70% of our energy in 2030 will be fossil fuels with a 70% renewable electricity target. That's tricky. It's very tricky in the public domain to get your head around that message, but that messaging is important because one of the great risks that we see in MaREI is just a sense of complacency, a sense of, well, this is going to be easy. We'll get to 70% in 2030 and another push for 30 afterwards, and it'll be easy to get to 100. It's not that at all. 70% renewable electricity is about 14% renewable energy. So we really need to share the lessons of success from electricity into the wider space and keep an eye on the wider system. So that's an important point that we do need to note. So within 2030, the whole system itself as a whole will be about 30%, maybe a bit higher, 30 to 32% in terms of overall renewable energy. But the headline figure here is the 4.5 million tons. And one of the things that we did was interesting in this study and was very helpful. We said, well, 4.5 million tons, what does that mean in terms of our emissions reduction targets? What does it mean in terms of our climate ambition? And we found actually, when we look at different climate budgets and we look at our obligations in the Paris Climate Change Agreement, that 4.5 million tons within ROI, it's about 6.3 within the all-island system, kind of gets us there or thereabouts at the top level of our climate change ambitions. It's not there, but it almost gets us in under the curve. We need to, I think the emissions it has to be below about 6.2 million tons. So what that tells us is that, look, we need to do a little bit better on the electricity sector, but at least we're there or thereabouts. That's very different to other sectors such as transport and heat or agriculture. So at least electricity is going in the right direction and we're at least trending towards our goals, which is an important message to come out from this study. If we look at this figure in a lot more detail, what we're looking at here is on the left-hand side. Now we're looking at the all-island system. So on the left-hand side is the all-island electricity system that we have in Ireland today. We have about just under 5 gigawatts of gas capacity, about 5.5 gigs of wind. Again, an amazing success story about our wind in Ireland. And we've about, a small number of EVs, small number of heat pumps. And then we've got some technical elements. And these technical elements are how we operate the grid. And there's sometimes, I won't go into all these in detail, but there are requirements in our electricity system in Ireland to keep a number of generators running, to keep a number of generators going, just in case something happens on the system. And these generators provide what we call inertia. They do provide many other services as well, but inertia is kind of like having, a couple of people on a tandem cycle, on a tandem bicycle. If one person stops pedaling, the people at the back will keep on pedaling, and that allows you to kind of push through any faults. So having these, what we call traditional generators or synchronous units generating at any one time allows us to what we provide system strength. And there's also different constraints in the system, and there's different elements and smart load. So what we're seeing on the left-hand side is the system in 2020. And then when we look at the climate action plan and we look at the UK government and look at Sony, look at the all-island system, we come up with an all-island system that meets a 70% renewable electricity target here on the right-hand side. And again, the important point here is from an all-island system, about 6.3 million tons, just at the top level of our Paris climate change agreements. It'd be better if they were a bit lower, but at least they're there. They're thereabouts, with about 2.2 gigs of interconnection. And this is stuff that we know in the public domain. And actually all this stuff actually was from data in the public domain. One of the I suppose, feedbacks that we got from the stakeholders from EAI when we started the study was, there's no need to reinvent the wheel. There's no need to come out with new numbers. Take the numbers that are there, but just put them all together. Put them all together, see what it means for emissions, see what it means for the reliability of the system. Looking at the all-island demand for 2030, we're coming up with a figure of just under 54 gigawatt hours. What would it be today? At the moment, about 36, maybe maybe 40 gigawatt hours in terms of, it probably should be terawatt hours. Yeah, it should be terawatt hours, about 40 terawatt hours. And then looking at the number of generators. So we took for this core scenario, what we did was actually we made an assumption about, well, let's just assume that 4 generators need to be online at any one time. And let's put in an SNSP level of 95%. And then we put in the amount of EVs from the climate action plan. We put in the amount of heat pumps from the climate action plan, scale those up for Northern Ireland as well. And that's where we come up with that figure of 6.3 million tons. But then, of course, we need to understand, well, how do we ensure that the system is reliable? So again, as I mentioned, wind is the main driver of decarbonisation. But what provides that reliability? And what we found in the study that was very interesting, we're still going to need conventional generation. And we're probably going to need a little bit more conventional generation than we have today. For these figures, for these studies, we're probably going to need about 5.2 or 5,200 megawatts of gas-fired generation. And often people, are surprised by that finding. Well, why would you need gas if we're going to have 70% of our electricity coming from wind? And this can be conflicting, and I appreciate that it's that in some areas it might not be a very welcome message, but it's fundamentally important for the reliability of our system, particularly on the days when it's very calm. If we have got 11,600 megawatts of wind on the system and 3 megawatts of 3 gigs of solar on the system, there are going to be days, and we'll come across those days later on, when it's just very calm, when it's just very dull. And then what we need in those systems, we'll be drawing on interconnectors, we'll be drawing on batteries, we'll be drawing on flexibilities, but we are going to need conventional generation to step up to the breach and provide that reliability for the system. Also, in terms of the operation hours of the system, one of the things that I found interesting from this study was that the amount of gas that we'll use in 2030 will only be about 20% less than what we're using today. Now, let me just repeat that again, because I find it interesting. The amount of gas will reduce by about 20%. And the reason for that is that when you look at your 70% renewable electricity target, okay, 70% of a demand, that's much bigger than a demand today. So demand is probably growing by about 20%. Half of that demand growth is from data centers. So we took EirGrid's median scenario for data centers, and the other half of that demand is from EVs and from heat pumps. And they're really good things to add to your grid, because EVs are incredibly efficient. A regular petrol powered car will emit about 120 grams for every kilometer we drive. In 2030, an EV with this power system will emit about 20 grams for every kilometer you drive. That's incredible. So these are really important things. The driver of electrification, putting more plugs on things like cars and heat pumps, delivers a wide system benefit in terms of emissions. And I'll talk about those there in a moment. But one of the key messages coming out from this is that, yes, we are going to need more gas capacity than we have today. That gas capacity will operate less, about 20% less. That's about 4 terawatt hours less. It's not a huge amount less. And part of that, again, is because, look, we have less coal on the system. We've got less solid fuels on the system. So gas has kind of got to do a little bit more on a smaller space. And that's why we're seeing those numbers not sink very far. So looking at some of the wider system implications, we did lots of sensitivities in the report, and please take time to have a look at them yourself. One of the sensitivities that we did was, let's be honest here, the level of ambition within the climate action plan for EVs and for heat pumps is incredibly high. So what would happen if we didn't meet those targets, if we fell short of them? And we just took an arbitrary number. Well, what if we fell short by 20%? What is the impact on emissions within the system and within the electricity system if we didn't, instead of installing a million, or instead of purchasing 1 million EVs by 2030, what if it's 800,000, and the same equivalents for heat pumps? And what you see here is actually an interesting thing. You actually have lower emissions from the power system. So your power system emissions aren't that high because your demand is a bit lower, and you think that's a good thing. But actually, when you step back and look at the wider system, you actually see a net gain in emissions. Because remember that petrol car I was talking about, they are still running on the road, and they actually generate about 900,000 tons of emissions. And this really clearly points to the wide system benefits of decarbonisation of areas such as transport and such as heat. And really, it's very helpful because it puts numbers. And I think when we launched this report back in November, these are some of the numbers that Minister Ryan mentioned, putting numbers with those narratives. If we don't meet our targets around transport, if we don't meet our targets around heat, these are the consequences and these are the numbers. And hopefully that will allow us to have better conversations around these things. Or their surprises. One of the things that we really enjoyed doing, well, I did, I'm not sure if Laura enjoyed doing it because these simulations took hundreds of hours, but we did this thing called, it's going to think that's done a lot in Europe, around NSOE and different utilities. They do a thing called Kalte Dunkelschlacht. That's German for cold calm days. I'm not sure what the Irish equivalent would be, Lawbrag rain or something, or yeah, I'm not even going to try and attempt it. But these are the days that, you know, that when you walk outside, you know, it's very calm. The atmosphere is very still. There's not much happening. And again, as I said, as we install more renewables, install more wind, and install more solar on the system, these are the days that you start to worry a lot more about. But you'll also have days like this. This is one of those days, you know, as a renewables enthusiast, these are the days that you dream about. You know, this is a 2-week period. And within the report, we did a number of these 2-week snapshots. And one of the things that I was really surprised by was how incredibly agile the power system is going to have to be in the future. You know, hats off to the people, to the women and men working in EirGrid and the different utilities. They are going to have to manage an incredibly agile and flexible system that's going to have to be resilient to lots of different types of weather systems, on top of the technical stuff that they already deal with. But now they're going to have these massive variations. The same system has to be resilient to all these different weather types. And this is a 2-week period. We've got lots of renewables. This is a, you know, this is a period in the winter, the shoulder months coming into spring. And again, these are the days you love. You know, you've got loads of winds, and within the modeling, you see this beautiful symphony of wind blowing, you've batteries charging and discharging, interconnectors, you've got your smart transport, you've got your demand side units, you have got your smart meeting home, all working together to absorb as much of that electricity as possible and use it. And look how very little gas is used along here. Gas is the little yellow sliver down at the bottom. And these are the days that really have incredibly low carbon intensity. And this is the kind of future that we need to strive towards, these very low levels of fossil fuels. And in this scenario, you have huge exports. And these are the kind of the days that are the good days. These are the days that you really want when Ireland is kind of an exporter of green energy, or certainly green electricity. But you're also going to have days when it's not like that, when it's very calm. And this is another model simulation. And this is a 2-week period. Now it's in the summertime. Now there's 2-week periods in wintertime as well. But I thought this period was actually interesting, coming across August, I think, or July. This is a 2-week period when renewable generation is very low. You know, and if you think of, I think there was, you know, looking at Martin Howley's updates. Martin provides very wonderful updates on wind, what it's doing during the months. And he mentioned, I think, one of his most recent blogs, that there was a couple of days when wind was about 10% capacity factor. You know, these are kind of, you know, a prolonged period of days like this. And these are days when actually you've got no other choice, but you need that gas generation, where gas, I think across this scenario here, you know, we're pulling in as much power as we can from the UK, we're pulling in as much power as we can from France, but we're still going to need the gas generation. In the summer months here, one of the things I did find surprising, another thing I found surprising in this study, was the role of solar. And I didn't quite expect this, actually. Solar has a real, I suppose, technical complementarity to wind. You know, wind is very strong on the in months and the shoulder months, but solar is very strong actually in the summer months, and actually helps us get a little bit closer to those res targets, which is very important. And within the report as well, we did these 4 kind of different weather windows, but we also show a scenario where pretty much all of the conventional generation is required. Pretty much all of the conventional generation is required within the system. And those are those very extreme cold weather days when there's just not a lot of weather around. It's very cold, demand is driving up. And one of the things that we notice within these studies, you know, if you look at days like this, but when these happen in winter, it's not so much when the weather comes from the west. You know, most of our weather comes from the west and the southwest, and that drives those high renewable days. But actually the days probably as a TSO that you're probably going to worry a little bit more about is when those weather systems come down from the northeast, when they kind of sit over the space between Denmark and the UK, kind of over the Netherlands, over the Doggerland areas. Those tend to block our weather systems, and they produce, you know, long periods of calm weather across Northwest Europe. And that has an impact for Ireland because, number one, we get calm winds, you know, so, you know, think back to 2010 with very low capacity factors in prolonged periods, but also it impacts the UK. It also impacts France. It also impacts Denmark. And this really limits our ability to import power from those countries. So again, these systems, while they don't come that often, when they do pop down from the polar regions and sit over the northwest of Europe, they're the systems that really kind of profoundly shape the system. And those are the weather systems, and those calm days are driving the need for conventional generation here in Ireland, and driving the need for that conventional capacity that we see in Ireland. So briefly, just 1 or 2 more slides now before I finish up. One of the things that we did in the report was, instead of, as well as quantifying, where our emissions will be in 2030, what the system needs to look like. We also looked at other decarbonisation options. What if we wanted to go beyond that? And of course, we should go beyond it. We need to get our emissions down as low as possible. And within the report, out to 2030, we looked at 4 discrete different options that we could look at. And one of the options is, and now this is important, this point here, these options are not additive. You can't add them all up together and say, well, we can get 5 or 6 million tons. These are all independent options that we could look at. One of the things we could look at, what if we had no min-gin requirements? What if we could drop the system right down to a completely non-synchronous system? Great work being done in Ireland up in UCD and in EirGrid on these ideas. We're not sure if we can get there at the moment yet. We'd have to invest probably in things like synchronous condensers, maybe grid forming inverters and things like that. But if we were able to get that system and remove that min-gin requirement, we could probably save ourselves about another 800,000 tons, about 0.8 million tons. And that's good. So that's a kind of a non-wires solution. We could also look at adding more wind capacity. So what if we added, I think within this scenario, we added another 5 gigs of offshore wind capacity. And this is interesting. And this is kind of provides a very unusual dynamic. That would reduce our emissions by 1.3 million tons. But we need to keep curtailment down. We'd have to do a couple of things. We probably need more interconnectors and we probably need more batteries. And the thing about adding more wind on top of a system that's already heavily saturated with wind is that it causes 2 things. From a policy perspective, it's good for your RES-E target because it generates more electricity, way more than you can consume. But from a decarbonisation perspective, what happens is that it tends to drive exports. And when you export power to other countries, the carbon benefit rests with those countries that import it. So when we import power from the UK or we import power from France, the emissions for the generation of that power would actually rest in those countries, not in Ireland. So from a policy perspective, there's an unusual dynamic here. Extra additional things like offshore wind, good for RES-E, but not so good for emissions unless we can use that power here in Ireland, either store it or make sure demand keeps up with it. And of course, you could add those 2 things together. What if you could do, add more wind and have a completely non-synchronous system? That's kind of, that's kind of the long-term game. That's kind of really what we need to be working towards. And that would drop our emissions by a further 3 million tons or 2.9 million tons. And now you're kind of getting serious in terms of your decarbonisation journey. And then you can look at things like carbon capture and storage. One carbon capture and storage plant converting either a CCGT or putting in a brand new plant with an 80% capture rate would remove emissions by about 1.1 million tons. That's a big chunk of emissions for one unit. And again, things you have to consider there, is it compatible with our net zero journey? What about those residual emissions? Those CCS plants typically capture 80%, 20% of emissions might be left over. Probably have to think a little bit about upstream emissions. And of course, the costs are uncertain there as well. So all that information is in the report. It's all there for you to digest. I think Darragh and his colleague Stephen have made all the appendices available. They're all there for anybody. And if any questions on the report, please don't hesitate to get in touch. So just summing up with our key findings, I suppose the main message coming out of this report is that, wind will be the wonderful driver of decarbonisation in the electricity system in Ireland. But the reliability of the system will still require us to have conventional generation. And it's very difficult to see us in a future without conventional generation, at least up to the period 2030. That's a tricky message to communicate, isn't it? Because we're all very excited about decarbonisation. We're all very excited about it moving away from fossil fuels, but we must remember that security of supply, keeping the system, keeping the lights on is fundamentally important as well. We need to, up our SNSP level, and EirGrid have done some incredible work over this, but there's also the grid. It's not just thinking about building more wind. We need to get the bit in the middle right as well. The grid needs to be flexible. We need constraints removed. And, that needs to be explained socially as well. The grid is a huge enabler, even though it's wires and pylons and stuff that sit there, provides energy to our homes. It allows us to feel warm and cozy. But it's also a really strong driver of decarbonisation. And that's something that is fundamentally important and brought out in this report as well. And again, to maximize, if we're generating all that supply of renewable electricity, we can really benefit our emissions reduction by using as much as we can of that energy in Ireland. So making sure that the electrification of different loads keeps pace with renewable electricity supply is something that we really need to keep an eye on. And again, massive investments. You know, we took numbers from the public domain. We looked at all different numbers from different reputable sources in Ireland, in Europe, Sysflex studies, and we looked at the cumulative, we're coming up with a figure of the cumulative investments. This is cumulative from now up to 2030 of about 32 billion euros for the all-island system. About 90% of that is in physical infrastructure, things like wind turbines and grid delivery, but also things like system services. So, you know, we're not dealing with small amounts of money here. And one of the messages coming out from the report is, you know, making these large investments, we need strong, stable, clear, concrete policy that sends those messages of stability into the future, because we're not talking about trivial sums. We're talking about a massive amount of investment here. And finally, of course, to support decarbonisation in Ireland and Europe, what we found is probably better to, as engineers, as an engineering community, as communicators of climate action, just to talk, to increase our climate literacy and to be able to speak more about the decarbonisation, not just about the electricity sector, but about the wider energy system in general and about our economy. Because when you start talking about decarbonisation, when you move away from focusing on the RES-E element only and take the broader picture, you start to see that everything matters. It's the supply matters, it's the grid matters, and it's the demand that matters. And so really to promote decarbonisation, that's something I think we can do as an engineering community while we promote this journey of decarbonisation. So Bernice, I might just hand it back to you, Bernice, and I will stop sharing my screen and be very delighted to take any questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Paul. That was great. I will start throwing questions at you. There's quite a few after coming in. We'll start with a general one from Oliver Walsh. Is it sensible to be approving planning permission for the data centres that are being proposed at the moment? They're highly electrically intensive facilities, putting additional pressure on the grid to meet the demand with very little return in terms of sustainable jobs.
Yeah, really good point. You know, and there's two ways of looking at that. You can look at as data centers as a burden on the system, but I also think there's a huge opportunity within data centers in Ireland. But we need to get that right, and they do need to, I think, play a more active role in decarbonisation. One of the challenges around, like, there's good and there's bad. One of the challenges around decarbonisation of data centers is the idea of synthetic offsetting, and if you look at the RES-E targets that we have at the moment, and if you look at the climate action plan, the real jump in ambition from the old 55% renewable electricity target that we have up to 70% is because of those data centers, because they're funding these green projects. Now, when you stand back and look at the old numbers, that actually ends up with a net reduction of our emissions. But a net reduction isn't good enough. One thing that I kind of take a lot of hope from, and we've had a lot of conversations in UCC with different data center providers. But if you look at the companies like Microsoft and the Googles, they have net zero visions for 2030. So my hope is, and I think it's a very valid point that we're making around data centers, that they'll be kind of dragged into this decarbonisation journey and hopefully up their game from just synthetic offsetting, which is a good start. But we need to go better than that. You know, if you're just buying 70% of our electricity will be clean renewables in the year 2030. That means that 30% won't be. So, you know, Facebook doesn't shut down when the wind isn't blowing. We need to ensure that we can encourage those companies to have on-site storage, to be flexible, look at grid services. If we don't get that right, I think there's a reputational risk to those companies and to Ireland as a whole.
Yeah, very good. Borgosh Energy, for interconnector imports, do you take the average CO2 intensity from the country we're importing from to contribute to the overall value, e.g. France versus UK?
No, it's zero. So the all electricity imports into a country are assumed to be zero. So it's the emissions rest with the country where it's generated.
Okay. Okay, next one is, how do you see the role of green hydrogen in achieving the targets?
Yeah, at the end of this report, and I suppose, Bernice, we didn't have enough time to go into today, but at the end of the report, there's a couple of sections on beyond 2030 and looking at different futures. And one of the things that we looked at two specific technologies. We looked at hydrogen, we looked at green hydrogen, and said, well, you know, even in 2030, what could we do if there's a certain level of wind curtailment in 2030? Let's just say there's 7% wind curtailment. What could we do with that in terms of transforming it to green hydrogen? And one of the things that we found out, we tended to communicate those numbers in terms of trucks and buses. So one of the tricky things I find from a public engagement perspective around hydrogen is that we talk about, you know, in kgs or in meter squared, but bringing it down to widgets of budgets or of buses or trucks is a helpful role. So if we look at the 2030 figures, I think we come up with a value of there's enough potential there to generate green hydrogen to power a kind of a pretty large bus fleet, something like a 1,000 or so buses. But the thing about green hydrogen, you know, we've talked about it for so often. You know, even I remember when I was back doing my PhD, you know, we're still talking about green hydrogen at the even back then. So I think we need to move on from the talking and start to do, you know, get some pilot projects off the ground. Even in MaREI, you know, looking at my colleagues Rory Monaghan, James Carton, and others, they're doing incredible work about trying to get these pilot phases up off the ground. So I'm very hopeful for green hydrogen. I don't think it's a silver bullet that many of us are expecting. I think it will play a very important role, particularly in the areas that we can't, that are too tricky to electrify or too expensive to electrify.
And maybe people might be interested. We will run a more detailed seminar on hydrogen in the Irish context in March time, so we'll get the details of that out as soon as possible, so it might be of interest to people. Michael O'Mahony, 70% curtailment of renewables in 2030, would have expected higher. What other solutions to curtailment are you assuming are happening in 2030?
Okay, sorry, Bernice, I didn't quite. So the level of curtailment that we expect to see in 2030 for that system is about 7%.
Sorry, did I say 70? I should have said 70.
Yeah, I almost fell off my chair.
Sorry.
Yeah, he's got it won't be so. So and Michael's question was, why isn't it higher, or why isn't it lower?
He would have expected higher. So just wondering if there's other solutions to curtailment that you're assuming in there.
Yeah, really good question, Michael. And hello, Michael. One of the things that we did in that report was that we really drove flexibility within the system. So for all those EVs, for example, for all those heat pumps, we assumed that about 20% of that load would be flexible. And this starts to play a really fundamentally important role in moving the demand around to match that supply. We did some sensitivities, Michael, in the report about looking at what would happen if that flexibility wasn't available, what is the implication in terms of CO2 emissions. So there's a number of things happen there that allow us to keep our level of curtailment relatively low. Now, many people, Bernice, would argue that 7% is too high, but this is kind of the things that we did. We looked at everything from interconnection. We've got demand side units. We've got smart metering on EVs. We've got smart metering on our on the heat pumps, and also we've got we really stressed the conventional units, dropping down to min stable levels. Pushing their ramp rate. So it's really a kind of a collection of all those things that come together to kind of hold that figure at about 7%.
Very good. Okay, next up, Kevin O'Rourke has 3 questions for you. So number 1, how does 30% overall RE by 2030 align with the government target, the 7% per annum reductions? Number 2, what does that mean if we only have modest reductions in agriculture and/or transport and freight emissions? And number 3, worth pointing out, the treatment of wind in your Sankey diagram should show no losses, whereas CCGT will have 45% losses. This is relevant because the 70% RESI target relates to outputs, not inputs.
Yeah, very good. Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, I just on the losses, first of all, please forgive me. They're actually kind of tricky to draw, and you're right. But what the losses show is I understand where you're coming. The losses are actually at the bottom, aren't they? But the losses are actually from the system, from the electricity system itself. It's not meant to represent the losses directly from the wind system. I know what you're saying now, because the wind is coming in one side and the losses are coming.
It looks like it's directly linked, yeah.
Exactly, yeah. So our losses are about 46% in the system today, and a bit lower in the future. But thanks, Kevin. We will work on that. In terms of the 30% ambition for renewable energy that I spoke, Kevin, that actually comes from the National Energy Climate Action Plan that we submitted to Brussels last summer. That's where I took that figure from. Now, there's a couple of interesting notes within that report. Number 1, it's presented as kind of a living document. It's saying, look, our ambition based on the best knowledge that we have at the moment is I think it's about 32% renewable energy for 2030. There's a strong caveat with that around the change for government. Of course, the National Climate Energy Action Plan was just submitted to Europe just after the new government was formed. So we'd expect to see some revisions for that plan, and hopefully those revisions will go up. But the official statement at the moment, the official position at the moment, Kevin, is at 30% or 32% figure, which comes from the National Climate and Energy Action Plan. And in agriculture, a great point in agriculture, we didn't touch on it too much in the report, but really it's, there's a fundamental truth in kind of a lot of these modeling exercises. The less we do in agriculture, the less we do in changing behavior, the less we do in transport, the less we do in heating, the more we will have to do with electricity. And if you look at, even at the Climate Change Committee over in the UK at the moment, they released their 6 carbon budget just this week. They're looking actually at the electricity system in the UK going negative from about 2032 onwards, with things like bioenergy, carbon capture and storage coming in 2027. And again, those negative emissions technologies, Kevin, are to pick up those residual emissions from the areas that either are a bit too slow to decarbonize, or too tricky, or too expensive to decarbonize.
Very good. Okay, so we've got piles of questions. I don't know if we're going to get through them all, but we'll try and get through a few more. Stephen Cole, has waste to energy been considered to reduce CO2?
Yes, yeah. So what we have, Stephen, in the report, we've taken the current capacity for the 2 waste energy plants in Ireland, and they're assumed to just stay there out to 2030. And it is the 50% of that is allowed to contribute towards the RESI target, and so it's assumed to be biodegradable. And we've an emissions coefficient in there as well. I can't remember what we use, but the emissions are accounted for it as well.
Okay. Donald Kassan asks, how will we incentivize the 2.5 gigawatts of gas-fired gen we need to back up the intermittent wind with low operating hours in 2030? Do you model green H2 bio CH4 blended with CH4 and gas-fired power generators? GNI and gas TSOs throughout the EU are looking at 20% green H2 blends, and this would reduce CO2 emissions significantly.
Yeah, thanks, Donald. Yeah, look, stepping back from this, when you read this report, you're kind of left with questions, how are we going to incentivize all this? We need more gas-fired generation. We need to spend, it's going to operate in an environment that's much more demanding, cycling a lot more, being too shifted a lot more, coming under a lot of physical pressure within the system, and also maybe making a lot less money. So the area that we didn't look at is the markets, and that is an important area, because I think we kind of bit off enough that we could chew within the study, looking at the system that was there. And we didn't look at blending of H2 within the system. We didn't look at blending of biogas within the system. But that's something that, of course, would have an emissions benefit, but wasn't considered in the study.
Okay. Yeah, phase 2 maybe. So Barry McMullen, can you comment further on the issue of upstream emissions, both CH4 and CH2, even if CCS is deployed on natural gas-fired generation? Also, did your model account for possible migration from CCGT to OCGT with or without CCS as capacity factors fall?
Hi, Barry, and great question, Barry. So the figures that you see there for the CCS, Barry, don't consider those upstream emissions. And you're completely right. We need to, if we're looking at something like CCS, not just consider the emissions within Ireland, but also those upstream emissions. And when we're doing the report, we looked at information from the Climate Change Advisory Council in the UK. So if you have a CCGT and it's operating at an 80% capture rate, you're generating electricity at about 80 grams per kilowatt hour. That's pretty good. Now, if you consider it's upstream emissions, and it very much depends here, Barry, on where you're getting that gas from. If it's coming from pipeline gas from Norway, it would have a relatively low emissions profile. There's really good practice in terms of regulation, strong regulation in the North Sea. And of course, very different emissions profile than if you're getting it somewhere like the USA, or if you're getting it somewhere from North Africa. So the figures that we have at the moment, Barry, we kind of lean a lot on the Iea Emissions Tracker. So the upstream emissions could be anything from, if it's coming from a country where it's well regulated and pipeline gas, the extra incremental addition would be about 15 grams per kilowatt hour, and then an extra 80 grams per kilowatt hour if you're coming from a poorly regulated country, unconventional gas. So really, when you're talking about CCS, as you said, it's not only good enough to consider about the emissions at the plant itself, step back and look at the broader picture and look at the wider emissions. And within the report itself, do we consider the migration of OCGTs or CCGTs to CCS? No, Barry, we didn't. We kind of just did this as a kind of a thought experiment. We just dropped one new CCGT plant into the system and just kind of put some numbers with, I think it's about 1 million tons. We didn't do anything around costs. Obviously, the retrofitting costs might be lower if you're coming from an existing plant, but the costs, of course, around CCS are uncertain.
Okay. I'm going to skip the next one, hydrogen, because we've already covered it. And a couple of people have asked about nuclear. How is nuclear viewed?
Yeah. Nuclear always comes up, and that's a good thing. I'm a fan of all areas of decarbonisation. We didn't look at it in the study. Now, let me just be honest here. The EAI gave us complete scope. They didn't. influence in any way, but myself and Laura, particularly myself, felt that, you know, if you start to put something like nuclear into a report like this, it just dominates the whole conversation. And there's some really important things coming out of this report around conventional generation, around emissions, around emission budgets, around different options. And we felt that putting nuclear in there would just kind of dominate the whole discussion. So we decided to leave it out. It's some, you know, my own personal views, some of my colleagues, some of my friends don't share a lot of these views, but I think we should need to consider all decarbonisation options. Now, whether it's suitable for Ireland or not is a big question. You know, if you're looking at these, I think large nuclear power stations, I think don't really make a lot of sense in an economy the size of Ireland. So really, you'd be looking to the smaller modular type. And of course, the difficulty there is that the commercial availability is highly uncertain. There's a very good report released last month. I think it's called 18 for Zero, that talks about these questions, looking at the next decade. One thing I will say about nuclear energy and small nuclear reactors, you know, it is uncertain, but it doesn't mean we should stop doing what we're doing today. We really don't have time on our side. We need to continue energy efficiency, continue the build out of renewables, continue the electrification. And in 10, 15 years' time, if there is new technologies available, we should consider those, but it cannot be an excuse for not doing what we're doing at the moment.
Okay. Another one from Michael O'Mahony. So if we generate very high VRE and have high exports, the marginal price will be very low, if not negative. This means we'll be paying other countries to take our renewable electricity at the Irish consumers' PSO price would increase significantly. Do we need other ways of managing this? We're getting into markets again, I suppose, but yeah, do you want to have a quick comment on that?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Look, and we didn't study markets, but I think, you know, when you step back and look at Europe, look at Ireland, look at the UK, you know, it's quite clear, you know, that the markets need to change. The power system is changing. You know, the way we produce power, the way we produce electricity is changing. Our markets will need to evolve with that as well. The current markets are on short-term marginal cost. You know, they weren't based on these kind of systems. So I think there will either be gradual transitions to different markets or abrupt changes, and which one would happen, I'm not really sure. But I think there is recognition that not only our markets, but our institutions need to change, our policies need to change, our own behavior needs to change if we want this future.
And maybe one last one, a couple along the same lines of what do you think in terms of microgrid and small scale electricity and heat generation will play in future zero carbon policy?
Yeah, you know, we need everything. You know, to be honest, you know, Bernice, you know, and you do a lot of this modeling as well. You know, I've never seen something that you wouldn't need in terms of decarbonisation. You know, I think one of the challenges that we have in Ireland that we tend to focus on our pet technologies that we like, and we tend to discount everything else. But we need everything. You know, you need to throw the kitchen sink at this thing, and then you need to throw everything else after it. You know, we need, you know, interconnections, microgeneration, energy efficiency. You know, we need bioenergy. We probably need negative emissions technologies. We need everything. And of course, the challenge then is understanding what is the best mix of all those technologies coming together. One of the things, again, that I was surprised in this report when we were doing the modeling was the role of solar. I would have written off solar years ago. You know, as an expensive technology that doesn't really help us that much in Ireland, but we see it actually really kind of not huge levels of solar, but having a modest helpful implication for the grid here in Ireland. So we kind of need everything, and I think that's really important.
Great. Listen, we've got actually quite a few more questions. I just don't think we're going to get to them. We're out of time. But what we might do, Sinead, is take those and ask Paul if he might look through the remaining questions, and we'll circulate some responses to those after the presentation.
Sure.
So listen, that was a fantastic hour, whistle stop tour. I think lots of people are going away now to dive into this report if they haven't done already, because there's so much detail in it and so much work into it. So well done to you and all your team there, and Laura and everyone else who's involved in it. Thanks for giving us your time this evening, Paul. And I think it's the start of a really good conversation, plenty of interaction here. Everyone is saying well done, super presentation. Hopefully you can see all those comments. As I always say, it's a shame not to be able to get a proper round of applause after something like this on the webinars. It's one of the drawbacks, but I think you'll see that everyone has really appreciated it. So thank you for your time. And just maybe to say, we will have our next event. We run our events first Wednesday of the month. We'll run the next one in March. It will be an energy efficiency topic with a couple of speakers. We'll get the details of that out quite shortly, and also that CPD seminar that will be covering a half-day event which will cover hydrogen in some more detail, which I think will be of interest to a lot of people as well. So stay tuned and we'll get those details out. And in the meantime, stay safe, and thanks everyone for joining.